increasingly now, you can only celebrate your national identity, if it's reframed through a celebration of international themes like diversity and multiculturalism. Every other group is allowed to celebrate its distinctive identity, history, and culture, except the British, the English. They must reframe their national identity around the celebration of diversity and liberal themes, right? And I was quite struck. I was reading Francis Fukuyama's book Identity recently for something I was writing, and he makes this really great point. He says, if the only basis of your national identity is diversity, or saying that you're welcoming of others, it's like saying you don't really have an identity of your own. There is no instinctive, instrumental belief in yourself if the only thing that you're saying is the basis of your entire identity is a celebration of some amorphous, vague, meaningless concept like diversity. And that essentially is what's happening in Britain. Essentially, Britishness, and more specifically Englishness, is either being reframed around this notion of difference and diversity, or the new elite are routinely attacking the foundations of that. Little England is used routinely as a derogatory term, that the Brexiteers were little Englanders. They didn't know what they were doing. They didn't understand the wonder and the complexity of London. They didn't understand the fantastic effects of diversity and immigration. They were little Englanders. Whereas if you speak to people in England, where I grew up, there was a very instinctive pride in being a little Englander. You are somewhere. You are defined by your ascribed identities, by your attachments to community, to locality, to being eccentric and strange and having very bizarre tastes. And all of these things are all well talked about in the 1940s and 1950s. But the new elite is sort of now in overdrive to kind of undermine this sense of national identity. And it's finding its expression in this asymmetrical multiculturalism, which I think is basically now the dominant framework, particularly in Britain. And you see it in Canada. Canada is Canada, right? But you see it increasingly in other countries too, as a new elite is searching for ways to reframe this sense of who we are. And that's why so many voters are rebelling, because they're saying, actually, there's something so much more to Britain, something so much more to England than the celebration of diversity.
Yeah, I mean, this is just a parenthesis, but it's there's so much beauty and culture and richness in England that we as immigrants are encouraged to not only disregard but feel superior to, which I think is incredibly corrupting. And I've seen people that I know be corrupted by this, in the sense that a lot of mainstream media in the UK is just about how little Englanders and racism, how it's pervasive. And I know a lot of people that have been convinced by this. They are convinced that the Englanders are racist against, Romanians. I mean, you would say there's probably a more Romanian phenotype, but these are white people who speak pretty good English. There's, it hasn't happened to me that people were racist against me, but I've seen people slowly be convinced that this is the case. And it's not something that is helping immigrants. It's not something that's adding to their quality of life. It's adding to this kind of conspiratorial haze that, we are being pursued by the majority. And it's in a way, it's doing the opposite of its intended effect. It's not felt as, we are differential to you. It's felt as, we are actively hostile, and we're just letting you know through the press that you're being persecuted.
It's a device that essentially the new elite use to control the national conversation. And that's, Michael Lind makes this point very well in his book, The New Class War, that essentially the new ruling class will stigmatize much of the rest of the country as racist, fascist, gammons, rednecks, deplorables, partly to delegitimize the arguments and points that they're making. And we've seen this in Britain, famously when the Labour Prime Minister Gordon Brown denounced a Northern Labour voter, Gillian Duffy, as a bigot when she said, look, how much migration is this country going to experience, right? Essentially, she was just asking a question. I mean, what's the plan here? Is this it? Just transforming Britain into a country of mass immigration? Is this the plan? And she was denounced as a bigot. And I think, in essence, this device also, which includes expanding concepts, so expanding concepts like racism and far right and so on, is used to really try and control the parameters of the national conversation, and to try and make it clear that some debates are beyond the pale. I don't think it's as successful as it used to be, because we've now got populist entrepreneurs who have basically broken through that and have, forced conversations onto the agenda. And I think voters have become very aware that this tactic is being used. But it is definitely happening. Now, if you look at the evidence in social science, where I work, beyond any doubt, levels of racism in Britain have never been lower. Levels of prejudice have never been lower. We're one of the least racist, prejudiced countries in the West today, as most academics also know. Now, of course, they won't point this out because it violates one of the founding creeds of liberal progressivism, right? The kind of catastrophizing that goes with portraying much of the West as institutionally racist. But it is true that we've never been as least racist as we are today. And you can also see this in the way in which the new elite talk about group-based disparities. And there was a very interesting example recently in Britain where we had a new report by Tony Sewell, a government report, which simply said, look, if you want to understand why some racial ethnic groups in Britain are doing better than others, it's not actually about racism. It's about family breakdown. It's about poverty. It's about complex mix of deprivation, cultural factors, local schools, and just kind of said it's not basically just to do with racism. And, as you can imagine, the reaction to that report was hysteria, and the new elite just couldn't handle it, right? That there might be something else going on than racism. And what is this family breakdown point? This sounds really controversial. And Tony was basically, faced a cancellation attempt. And this was best symbolized by having the offer of an honorary doctorate from my old university, the University of Nottingham, withdrawn because Tony was considered to be too politically controversial for suggesting that racism was not at the root of everything. Now, here's the irony. Nottingham simultaneously has 2 university campuses in China, takes truckloads of money from Chinese international students and leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, but does not see that in any way as politically controversial. But if you question the central creed of liberal progressivism, as Tony did, then you are basically outcast. Now, that in a nutshell was a great example of how the new elite see the world around them, and what happens, I think, when you violate these expanded concepts and these, the language that goes with the new ruling class.